Hello again, everyone. This is Alex Toth, part 11. And let me dive in. This guy was a driven artist. Cy Barry talks about what else did this issue. Alex Toth. Interview conducted by Jim Amash, transcribed by Brian Kimwars. Cy Barry, who was interviewed in depth in Alter Ego number 37, drew for DC in the 1950s and in the 1960s, became the artist of the long-running newspaper strip The Phantom. In the 1960s, became the artist of the long-running newspaper strip The Phantom. I remember Billy Zane played The Phantom in a movie. It was like a throwback. I think it was made in the 90s, but it's supposed to be like, I think it took place in the 30s, and it had that quality about it. Pretty good from what I remember. That's Toth's version of The Phantom. So Jim Amash asks Cy Barry, what was your initial impression upon seeing Alex's pencils? I guess Cy Barry was an inker, but then again, he was an artist of The Phantom, so. I was extremely impressed. I marveled at the clarity and the marvelous placement of blacks that Alex had a skill for. He had an acute eye for design and composition, and I just was thrown for a loop every time I looked at his pencils. They were glorious pencils to ink. His pencil work was very clean and tight. I probably could have inked his roughs because I had been in the business for a while, and some pencils' work was just roughs. I had to reinterpret them and give them the completed blacks and the finished drawing. So, having learned how to do that with other artists, it would have been easy and a joy inking Toth's layouts, just as roughs. Amash asks, did he shade in his black areas or did he just put an X? Barry says, oh no, he shaded them in. As a matter of fact, what I would do is I would take a kneaded eraser and knead down the page, erase down the page very lightly, so I'd be packing up most of the graphite and ink directly over his pencils. Huh. Interesting. I would take a kneaded eraser and knead down the page, erase down the page very lightly so I'd be picking up most of the graphite and ink directly over his pencils. The ink wouldn't take too well over the graphite, so you had to lighten them in order to put the blacks in comfortably. Man, that's a dangerous thing to do. If that kneaded eraser really picks up too much of the pencil, if it's, I don't know, interesting. I know that some inkers at times, they put like an overlay and inked in that, like a tracing paper type thing. But, you know, it doesn't work as good with the ink. But so Amash asks, did he pencil with a heavy lead or dig into the paper? Barry says, I would say he used an HB. No, he didn't dig into the paper. That's another thing that impressed me. It's almost as though his mind's eye had seen the picture before he laid a single line down. I never saw him pencil, but I could just visualize the way he sat down at a page, ruled out the panels, and then saw these compositions in his mind's eye, and just put them down so cleanly with such sureness. It was incredible to see the finished product. Amash asks, did you read the story first, or did you just start inking? Barry says, I read it, yes. I love to see how he interpreted a story. And I had the script in front of me as well. Usually the inker needs the script just to get an idea what the writer was writing about and what was in the captions. Now that's a committed artist. I mean, think about it. You know, they used to dismiss inkers as tracers, which is bullshit. Some inkers were really artists and they were really added to the pencils. But this guy's committed again because he was reading the script, you know, being quote unquote just an inker. He took it seriously. It's very cool. I haven't heard that from inkers. And he goes, just to get an idea what the writer was writing about and what was in the captions and what was behind the scenes in the script. I read the dialogue and the captions and the lettered artwork itself and put it all together. Amash asks, would Alex deviate from the script? And like our last video, he deviated a little too much for the taste of Joe Kubert. So again, he asks, would Alex deviate from the script? And Barry says, yes, many times, with a great deal of anxiety on the editor's part. Jim laughs. And many times he had a good sense of story. Alex was a very bright guy, very well-informed and well-educated. He was a very pleasant guy to talk to. And we had a few somewhat intellectual conversations at lunch. Now think about that. Toth's reputation, right? This ogre, this curmudgeon. And Cy Barry is saying he was a very pleasant guy to talk to. we had a few somewhat intellectual conversations at lunch. On one occasion, Alex, Joe Giela, and I had lunch together. Alex was having another one of his little fits in the office, and we kind of got him out there and took him to lunch. So Alex and I were having a little conversation, and we were hoping that Joe would join in. Finally, after about 10 minutes of conversation, Joe said, "You're both full of crap." Mutual laughter. You know, there's a way of breaking up the seriousness of the conversation. Joe just wanted to get a little sense of humor in there. Alex and I just cracked up laughing. Alex really liked Joe. That's hilarious. That's really good to hear because, again, you know, Toth's reputation precedes him about being a curmudgeon, a nasty guy, always nasty. It's just bullshit. It's bullshit. I mean, everything you hear about him is just, he could be pissed off, sure. But that's just to dismiss his humanity, to say he was only like that. And that's pretty cool that he could roll with that. Some guys can't, just to be blunt, they can't. So Amash asks, when you said Alex had fits in the office, I know there was the problem he had with Julie Schwartz and the paycheck. Note, see alter ego number 38 and 46, Roy. Were there other problems besides that? Barry says, I think he wanted to get more covers to do. And he also had an idea of going beyond just doing pencils. He wanted to ink his own work. Now that, especially in those days, was big. They had a very, regimented idea, right? Writer, penciler, inker, letterer, colorist, period, editor. Even in those days, it was, I think the comic strip artists had a little more leeway to do that, from Milton Caniff to Roy Crane and Noel Sickles. But Toth, he wanted to ink his own stuff. So let's see what happened. He wanted to ink his own work, and in those days, it wasn't being done. But later on, I think he may have seen this in some foreign magazine. He would have loved to do them in semi-finished color, or realistic color. In other words, just a pen outline color. We saw some Italian magazines during the 50s that were done almost photographically in full color. And he had a concept of doing things like that. And he wanted to do many more covers then. But the editors had other ideas for him. They needed him for the interior artwork. Usually we discussed our feelings about art and what he was doing at that time in comparison to the artistic education he'd gotten. He felt some of the basics were good, but he felt there was a lot more that basic education could have offered and could have filled the young artists in with, such as a better concept of composition and design. He felt that not enough of that was being done, and you know how well he executed composition and design. He was incredible, and I loved it because I was learning from it. He was maybe a year or 2 years older than I was. So Amash asks, did the topic of conversation include other people's work? And Barry says, Alex had a great respect for my brother Dan's work. Dan Barry. He was maybe 3 years younger than Dan. When Alex was novice, he looked up to Dan because Dan had already established himself. But Alex always had his own idea of his own concepts, and he really developed them. And I must say that it was that his work had entirely different technique and style and concept than Dan's. I think you can recognize that. And we should all respect the differences between us. I mean, that's what makes each of us recognizable. Man, yeah, sure does. Hamaj says, your ink line was more organic than Alex's. He seemed to be a little more geometrical and hard-edged. You know, when he says that, now this is Cy Barry's inks over Toth. It's fine lines. It's very good. I mean, no doubt about it. But again, Toth was his greatest inker, his best inker. But this is definitely good. You know, look at that. Beautiful. But he was his best inker. And when he mentions here that, you know, it's more geometric and whatnot, it's not as organic, that's true. But he was just, he didn't care about the tools per se. He just wanted a controllable line. I think I mentioned the other day that EBS mentioned about someone asked him if he uses brush like I do. And he says, no, you know, he wants something a little more controllable. And maybe that's what Toth was going for as well. I mean, the brush can be unwieldy at times if you're not used to it. But if you're used to it, it's the ultimate inking tool. It really is. It's beautiful. From really thin to thick within a second, within a flick of the wrist. I mean, it's beautiful, the flick of the fingers. So about Toth's inking technique. So So Barry says, yes, it was geometrical and hard-edged. Yes, it was. And as much as I recognized that, I still respected what he was trying to do. He was looking at the overall completed subject. He saw the work as a pattern, almost like going into a museum and seeing a painting. He saw areas of black and white and gray that were a little different, a little more unusual, a little more extreme and striking. He always wanted to get that feeling of striking black and white. You saw some of that in some of the stuff that he inked himself. It was an even more extreme black and white, it sure was. So Amash asks, there were some differences in your styles. How did that affect your approach to inking him? And Barry said, I loved his line, yet I felt it was a little different than mine. I tried to give it a little more softness and a little more delicacy, but that's the thing right there. Toth was a hard guy with hard lines. Trying to soften that. It's like when Danny Bellinati inked Dave Mazzucchelli. It was completely wrong. I mean, completely wrong. Too many broken lines, too much detail, too many focuses on the unimportant. Mazzucchelli really took off when he started inking his own work. So, he noticed this fine stuff, all the detail in the hair that Toth wouldn't necessarily fuss about. He just wouldn't. He'd get on with the hair with a few strokes here and there and just move on. But it is very good still. Let me look at this. This was in the 51. This could have been right before he blew up and took off, and after he studied the famous artists' books. Okay, so there were differences in his style. He goes, I loved his line. Barry says, I loved Toth's line, yet I felt it was a little different than mine. I tried to give it a little more softness and a little more delicacy here and there, rather than a harsh, hard line. I think the delicacy against the strong, sharp blacks, that contrast is what really set one thing against another. In fact, I don't even think Toth recognized precisely what made my inking a little different than most of the other inkers on his work. Yeah, I mean, to hear Toth's art being made softer, more delicate, it's almost offensive to me. But again, it does look good. I mean, look at the blacks. Beautiful. Look at the silhouettes. Look at that even, that rock. Amash asks, did you ever change how he spotted blacks? I'm just wondering if you modified very much. And Barry says, yes, I did. And he's still alive to talk about it? Anyway. Yes, I did. Just very little here and there. I would add a little more along the contour of a shape or leave a little more white than he did, just so the eye could see a little more white. After a few years of inking, I discovered what the black areas of inking does is accentuate the white areas. I love this, and I learned this years ago. After a few years of inking, I discovered what the black areas of inking does is accentuate the white areas. The white areas. The reader's eyes look at the white areas, not at the black. The artist looks at the blacks. So this is interesting, isn't it? The reader's eye looks at the white area, not at the black. The artist looks at the blacks. So you and I will look at blacks and see how interestingly someone will lay them in. But the real purpose of those blacks is to give the whites their shape and their form. That's awesome. It's well put. The more you chop up those whites, the more you cut into those whites, the more difficult it is to see the clarity of the object. So Amash asks, did he use line weights on figures, or did you add them? Barry says he didn't put weights in for the holding lines themselves. No, he basically used one weight. Listen, he knew that inkers are professionals, and it's up to them to give the weights of the lines. How much can a pencil put in there without failing to leave some interpretation for the inker? If somebody didn't ink his work with some professionalism and with some of his own thought and his own interpretation, then Alex held very little value for them. Did he ever offer his opinion in your inks over him? Barry said, sure. He said, there's something in there in your inking that defines you and separates you from most of the inking that's being done on my work. And I hadn't really thought of that until he made that statement. And I had a tremendous amount of respect for that statement. I tried analyzing over and over again what I was doing that made it a little different. And I think it was that sensitivity of adding that bit of softness and delicacy here and there, in contrast to the strong, exciting, and dramatic blacks that he portrayed in the pencils. The contrast between the two is what gave it an added element, another dimension. I guess so. I mean, if you think about it, sometimes clashes do produce something better than it would otherwise. It's possible. And Toth was a very hard-edged artist. He was. His inks were hard. And this guy, I guess, it is a little more delicate there, isn't it? I don't know. Regardless of whatever, it looks good. It's very nice. Very fine. So, Amash asks, I want to get your opinion. I want to get your opinion on something that Gil Kane had said about that time period. In the late 1940s and through much of the 1950s, Gil felt that DC penciling house style was either Alex Toth or Dan Barryish. Do you agree or disagree? Barry says, I would say first Dan Barry's interpretation was called for. I do agree with Gil because Dan started working for them before Alex did. And suddenly the editors were looking to get Dan to work on their books, particularly on gangbusters, adventure stories, and characters like Vigilante. So the editors began requiring their artists to get some kind of interpretation that had Dan's style in it. When Toth came in, he was a whole new, fresh concept, and I loved it. It was far different than my thinking and the way I developed, and it was so interesting to me. It really struck me, and I just felt that it probably just needed a couple little lighter touches to it to really make it a presentable style, according to my taste. Gil was correct when he said that Alex's work was tremendously influential. Amash says, did Alex's pencils influence the way you did your own art? 1 second. Let's take a sip. Thanks. So he goes, did Alex's pencils influence the way you did your own art? Barry says, that's a very, very good question, because that was one of the things on the back burner that I was thinking about. I must admit that every time I ran into some kind of problem in the way of designing a panel that had 2 or 3 elements in it, Alex had such a wonderful way of combining those things. He had this marvelous eye for keeping the design, yet solving complicated problems, and I would refer to him in my storytelling. As much as I admired Dan's storytelling, as there were few better storytellers, Dan tended to get very complicated when there was more than one action going on. The stuff got very heavy. One thing Toth had a genius for was taking 3 different actions in one panel and utilizing them in such a way that you could still read it, see it, and understand it without confusing the reader. So every time I had that kind of a problem that was difficult to solve, I would just check again through the pages of the old comic books and get reinvigorated. I'd think, gee, that's a marvelous idea. What a nice concept that is, and utilize it in a different way, but still utilize it for the composition I needed to draw. I must say I use his work very, very much. It may not have shown, but there were elements in his storytelling that I had used and admired. Amash says, when I asked you about Alex changing the scripts, were they minor changes or major ones? Barry said, oh no, they were just minor changes. Maybe a bit of dialogue or throwing in a different figure, because sometimes it didn't read right and the editor totally missed it. So Alex would just do it himself without calling the editor. He didn't feel he had to. Sometimes the editor would say, hey, why didn't you call me about it? Why didn't you tell me? What does he have to tell him for? He wasn't taking his authority away. So, this is in contrast to what Kubert was saying in the last video, episode 10. Check it out if you haven't. Hey, why didn't you call me about it? Why didn't you tell me? What does he have to tell him for? He wasn't taking his authority away. This is the kind of crap that you had to deal with some of those infantile editors, Jim laughs. That's hilarious. Oh man, this is right after the Joe Kubert interview. This is pretty funny. If Joe Kubert read this at the time, I'm not sure if he would have chuckled, but pretty funny. This is the kind of crap that you had to deal with some of those infantile editors. Hilarious. And he goes, really? They're so worried about their job and worried about the competition between the editors and recognition, and will their position be hindered in any way? Are they more vulnerable than the next guy? That kind of thing. And the artist is thrown in the middle of this. Alex had no patience for that, and I don't blame him. I didn't have any patience for it myself. Pretty cool. So Amash asks, is there anything else you'd like to say about Alex? So Barry says, when I left DC around 1961, Alex faded out of my life, and I became involved with the Phantom strip, and I was in a totally different area. I wasn't seeing too many of my dear old comic book friends, and I was being introduced to more and more comic strip friends, so I kind of began to lose touch with the comic book artists, except for Joe Gala and a couple of other guys. I really lost touch with guys like Bernie Sachs and Alex. Alex loved to talk about comics. He was a motor mouth when it came to art and artistic interpretation. I love that. Even if you didn't ask him about it, he volunteered. Oh man, pretty funny. I'm on the Comics Gate Kings on Mondays, Ethan Van Sciver's show, with about sometimes a dozen cartoonists are on there, and I had the honor of being invited to be part of it. And sometimes I've seen Ethan tell, and again, I just relay this to myself, and I'm not comparing myself to it, but just these things remind me of, like, he's a motor mouth, loves talking about comics. I love talking about comics. I can talk about comics for hours. And he had to tell a few of the cartoonists on there at times over, the last few months to come on, to speak up, to spit out, to contribute to the show. And he has yet to tell me that, because again, I do have I always put in my 2 cents. I don't, believe me, I understand it's a big show with a lot of people on it, but you have to say what you got to say when you got to say it. So I have yet to hear him try to nudge me to speak. So, because again, if you love this medium, you cannot help but speak about it for hours. I mean, literally. I saw an interview with Jim Shooter where it was a 7-hour podcast, and he just kept going. That guy loves comics. And I love Jim Shooter. I mean, whatever you hear from anyone else, to be honest, whatever you hear about the terrible time, some of the best work was ever produced in Marvel when he was editor-in-chief, and he had a lot to do with that. Frank Miller came to be, under Jim Shooter's editorial, I guess, control at that time. And one small example, when if you haven't read the Elektra storyline, read it before listening. You can leave now. I'll give you 3 seconds. 1, 2, 3. But when Frank Miller decided that he wanted to kill off Elektra, he went into Jim Shooter's office and said, whether he called Mr. Shooter or Jim, probably Jim, but he goes, Jim, I want to kill Elektra. And Shooter sighed and said, tell me the story. Meaning, okay, let's see if we're going to kill her. If it's a good story, okay. And that's a standard, isn't it? It's like, kill her for what? If it's a hell of a story, if it's worth it, for sure. If it's not, hell no. Why? She's a popular character. Anyway, so, okay, look at Toth's early work, right? Teenager. You could still see the heavy blacks, the anatomy. You could still see it there. It's awesome. Okay, so where were we here? Okay, Alex loved to talk about comics. He was a motor mouth when it came to art and artistic interpretation. Even if you didn't ask him about it, he volunteered. I love that. I know that Alex would get a little bit bored with those long discourses of Gil Kane's. Oh, yeah. I've read some of his stuff. He could be a blowhard. Gil Kane, that is. Whereas Toth, I can just swallow. Completely read all of his articles, enjoy every word of it. But Gil Kane was a nasty fuck also, because I remember one time he tried to condemn Toth by saying that something along these lines, that Toth was nasty about the Japs, I think, in World War II, that he wanted them all dead. Something like that, right? It had no place in the interview, and Toth got pissed off, and he publicly, went after Gil Kane. I don't remember the details about it, but I think it was in the Comics Journal that Kami, Gary Groth, who runs that rag. I remember it was him and Barry Windsor Smith trashing Joe Kubert, trashing John Buscema. It's like, who the hell are you guys? I mean, really. I know Barry Windsor Smith is a great artist, no doubt about it, especially in his Valiant stuff. I mean, I love that stuff. His storyteller stuff was good, but I don't know. Maybe a little too pompous, to be blunt. I know the interviews were. And I got his monster comic. You know, it was something that he started working 40 years ago, where Bill Mantlo stole the story I did from him for a Hulk story. I read it. I'm not sure if I'm ever going to reread it. It's I don't know. It's not that great. I was told it's great by some people who reviewed it. No, it's not. The story's not great. Some of the art's really good, no doubt, but 40 years? Yeah, it better be better than that if it's for 40 years in the making. But anyway, they were trashing John Buscema about how he would hack it out and mocking How to Draw Comics in Marvel way. Hey man, you can say what you will about that book, but god damn it, I learned a lot from that. And you have a master artist taking his time to draw a book on drawing comics, and Stan Lee, writing the book. Come on, I mean that's a joke. And then you got Joe Kubert also with another book on cartooning. I'd rather read these books and it's those two guys who these guys were ruthlessly mocking. I mean, what, arrogant hacks. Anyway, so Amash asks, Gil and Alex both were incredibly opinionated people, and they had opposite ideas on everything. Were you ever witness to any of that? Yeah, I think Gil came as a damn leftist, from what I gather. Toth was a right-wing conservative. Barry says, I believe so, at least. Barry, there was one lunch I can remember when we were all together, along with Joe Gala. Joe held his hand over his mouth and chuckled at the two of them, Toth and Kane. Later on, he said, remember the time I told Alex that he was full of crap? And you and Alex burst out laughing? Well, that's what I was thinking then, but I didn't want to say it. I was covering my mouth because I didn't want to say it. Mutual laughter. Joe, my sweet Joe, he's great. Right now, he's at the San Diego convention being honored for his work on the U.S. postage stamps. So Amash asks, that's right. And he just mentioned, sorry. That's right, and he deserves it. Joe's been overlooked. Barry says, yes, he has, but he's getting his recognition now, generating a lot of fans behind him, and he's really making up, I think, for a lot of lost time. Getting back to Alex, I knew he had a very strong personality, and I knew he had a very strong ego, and was extremely super sensitive, a very intense individual. But that's what made Alex. Maybe it's those negatives that made him such a genius, that made such a genius out of him. Because this guy was a driven artist. He had a burning lamp inside him that kept going and going, even through the worst periods, when he faced greatest difficulties. I mean, this guy always turned out the most incredible pieces of work and was always trying to change, trying to do something different. I must say he was just a brilliant and very, very dedicated artist. His personality had some flaws, but he had very few flaws in his ability to draw and to entertain people with his pictures. Well put, Cy Barry. Very well put. Love it. So I'm going to end it now, this video, and I'll come back to Lou Sayer Schwartz next. Alex was into everything. Until next time, everyone. And again, if you could subscribe, I would appreciate it. And like the video if you do like it. And spread the word. I just really want to, I have a small channel. It's slowly growing, but I just want to hopefully one day get my channel to be a little more viewed, and people could discover Toth through this. They could learn what his thoughts were, what others thought about him, and then they can discover his art. So hopefully that happens. Take care. Until next time.